I'm Brad Hooker, and I'm one of the directors of Ethical Reading. And today we have a webinar by Professor Joe Wolff, who is going to speak to us about risk. Ethical Reading was, Ethical Reading was started a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, and it's a not-for-profit social enterprise. Our mission is to help embed ethics into the way we live and work in Reading and make Reading a nicer place to live and work. We want to inspire, educate, and collaborate. And in fact, we've just finished a session this morning of major collaboration with other Reading not-for-profits. We have 45 partners and supporter organizations and over 3,000 individual members and followers and 20 very important volunteers. And we're trying to take the things we've learned and help other cities also become ethical cities. So we consider ourselves mounting an ethical cities movement. Some of the things we do include a code of ethics and a ethical recruitment charter. We also have Tuesday evening meetups the last Tuesday of each month, and this is obviously a webinar, but we also have other kinds of meetings. Now I think I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Joe Wolff.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brad, and thank you to Ethical Reading and to the participants who have given up much of their lunchtime today on a Friday of all days to come and listen to me talk about the ethics of risk. So when I started working on ethics of risk, it wasn't an idea I had myself. Like a lot of the work I've done in public ethics and what some people call applied moral and political philosophy has been a result of other people asking me to look at something. And in this case, if you cast your mind back to around about 2002, 2003, if you have a memory that goes back that long, you may remember a spate of train crashes in the UK. Hatfield, Potter's Bar, Ladbroke Grove, there was a cluster of train crashes within a few years, and in some of them, a substantial number of people died. Ladbroke Grove, I think about 20 people died. Initially, it was thought there were hundreds of deaths, but it's very hard to know how many deaths are on a train because we often don't know how many people were on the train to begin with. But there were press stories saying that there were hundreds of people who died. And John Prescott, who was Minister of Transport, I believe, at the time, was recorded on BBC as saying that we should never compromise on safety, that we should never skimp on money safety. We should make the trains as perfectly safe, and money should be no object. Now, this went down quite well with the press and the public, but it didn't go down at all well with the industry because relatively few people were dying on the railways at that time. Maybe 10 people a year on average, 5 to 10 people a year on average in train accidents. Of course, there were suicides, trespassers were dying. So the numbers of deaths on the railways were actually in the hundreds, but deaths to passengers were very small. And if only a small number of people are dying, then it's going to cost a lot of money to save the next one. In fact, there were some technologies that were considered called ATP, Advanced Train Protection, where even the defenders were saying it was going to cost about £100 million to save a statistical life. Now, we talk about a statistical life because, of course, when you introduce railway safety measures, you can tell statistically fewer people will die if you've done it right, but you can't tell who they're going to be. You can't say that person would have died, but now we've saved their life. So we're not talking about saving the life of a particular person. What we're talking about is making the environment slightly safer for everyone, and that on average will add up to a saving of lives. So the railway industry were told by the government that money was no object to saving more lives. The Observer newspaper was calling the industry negligent for not introducing ATP, advanced train protection. But the industry were very worried about this. It wasn't that they were worried about their own money, because at that time in the settlement, the taxpayer was paying for safety improvements. So it would have been you and me in our taxes paying for any safety improvements, not the privatized companies. And they made a very reasonable point. They said, suppose you have £100 million and you want to save some lives. What's the best way of spending it? Well, just about the worst thing you could do would be to spend it on the railways, because so few people are dying, you can hardly save anyone. If you've got £100 million to spend, if you put it into road improvements, you might save 100 times as many people. If you put it into the NHS, you might save 1,000 times as many. Put it into international development, you might be saving hundreds of thousands of lives. So why save one life on the railway for all that money? So that was how I got involved in thinking about the ethics of risk, because the railway industry thought they needed some moral philosophy to work this out. And why was that? Well, you may see it already, but there are two different ways in which you can think about saving a life on the railway. I've given you the consequentialist approach, which says we've got a certain amount of money, we want to spend it to do as much good as we can. From a consequentialist point of view, it is crazy. It's immoral to spend more money on railway safety, because you can do so much more work with it a different way. But after an accident, quite often there's the parent of someone who died, and they'll be on the radio. And remember the days when we all used to wake up to Radio 4? Well, there was always a story about a train crash, maybe once a week or once a month. Even though there were hardly any crashes, there were plenty of stories. And there'd be someone, Nina Borden, for example, a novelist who was in a train crash herself and sadly lost her husband, would say things like, the technology exists to stop these trains from crashing. Other countries do it. Germany does it. France does it. It's just a matter of money. Why are we being so mean-minded? They say things like, a train driver has to look out of a dirty window in the rain to see a red light to stop the train. In other countries, they have systems that just stop the train. You don't need the driver looking through a dirty window. This is the 21st century, and we're relying on Victorian technology. Surely we should just do it. And I could have a day where the day before I'd been to a seminar with the rail industry, and I heard the consequentialist arguments. I was completely convinced. Next morning, I'd wake up and hear Nina Borden saying, other countries do this. It's just a matter of money. We should just spend the money and stop being so penny pinching about it. And I think, you know what? She's got a point. Why don't we just do this? And then half an hour later, I think, what did I just say? £100 million to save one life. How ridiculous. We'll probably kill more people by taxing that amount to save one life on the railways, because we may be pushing people into lower quality diets, getting people to buy more dangerous goods, for example, if their taxes go up. So what I saw from the ethics of risk point of view, we've got this fascinating clash between consequentialism that says we should do the best with our money, and a type of absolutism that says one avoidable death is too many. And if we know how to save a life, we should save it. So this really frames the question for me about the ethics of risk in that particular context of transport safety. And I'm going to press on thinking along those lines, but I need to frame the discussion in a couple of ways. So one thing to say is when people talk about risk, quite often people talk about the positive nature of risk. So a risk-taking economy is a good one. People love risk in their own lives. People go on holiday to experience risk in various forms. They go skiing, snowboarding. Not me, but apparently some people enjoy that. So there are ways in which people seek risk in their lives and think of risk as a good thing. Okay, good luck to you if you're like that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when risk is a bad thing. So risk is a hazard, a bad thing that is uncertain. So it's a hazard times probability. Also, in the example I gave of people going on skiing holidays, people are voluntarily taking risks. So I'm not, again, talking about voluntary risks. I'm talking about the imposition of risk. And really the question is, under what circumstances is it morally legitimate for one person or agent to impose risks on others without their consent, without their explicit agreement to it? So when in life is it acceptable for me to impose risks on you? And of course, what could seem an obscure scholarly question at any moment bursts into life, and that's what's happened right now. Because in a way, the most topical question of public debate is exactly this. What right do I have to impose risks on others? That is, if I wear a mask when I go out, then others are less likely to get infected if I have the COVID-19. So what we're talking about in ordinary life is the circumstances in which it is legitimate for me to impose risks on you without your consent to that specific risk. Okay, so that's the question. And what I'm going to do is run through 4 theories that we find in the literature and come to a conclusion about what I think is the right thing to agree to. Now, the first thing you might have thought of, and this is a very intuitive view, is that generally speaking, we don't allow anyone to do anything to another person without their consent. So if you go to the doctors and the doctor decides just to operate on you, that is illegitimate without your consent. I can remember my mother being horrified when a dentist told her that he had decided not to take out my brother's teeth when my brother was about 12. And the outrage was thinking that this was the dentist's own decision to make, that whether my brother should keep his teeth or not. So normally we think it's a gross violation in some way if people do something to you without your consent. And so why should risk be any different? Why should you allow people to impose, why should we as a society allow people to impose risks on you unless you've consented to it? But you've probably already seen the problem with this. Everything you do in life pretty much imposes some risk on other people. The driving is the most obvious example. If you drove here, then you impose some risk to quite a large number of people as you did it. However careful you are, the tire in your car might blow out and you might career across a road. You might have a momentary lapse. There are many, many ways in which you can impose risks on others. And you're no better off on a cycle, you're no better off walking even. So you can, people have died. Well, many years ago, I worked in the Prudential Assurance Company in the law department, and next door was the HMSO office. And they had a publication on causes of death. And the causes of death were things like, my favorite, I think, were people falling from a lower level to a higher level. I used to puzzle about how that was possible. How could you possibly die by falling from a lower level to an upper? So I'll leave that as an exercise for you to think about. But there are so many ways in which we inadvertently set traps for other people in life. Everything we do imposes some risk. Now, you might be thinking of counterexamples. You might think, well, under lockdown, you haven't been imposing that many risks on anyone. Well, you're wrong. People have been delivering your post. They've been delivering your food. You've been relying on other people to take risks for you to survive. Okay, so the idea that we have a right not to have risks imposed on us, well, that might be good in theory, but in practice it leads to what people have called the problem of paralysis. We could not do anything. We'd spend all our lives waiting for the consent form to come back before we could leave our rooms, but even staying in our rooms probably imposes some risk. So that idea, first theory, that we have a right not to have risks imposed, won't work. Where do we go next? Well, here's a second theory that some libertarians played with for a while, and maybe some people still believe this. And this theory says, actually, you can do whatever you want. You can impose whatever risks you want on others, but if the bad thing happens, then you should compensate. So you drive your car, crash into someone, okay, you compensate them for it. You don't have to take precautions, it's up to you. And you can see how this could appeal to a certain cast of mind. Let people be free, but make them pay for any costs they cause to others. And maybe they'll take a lot more care that way, actually. If you know that you have to pay if you do some damage to someone, then maybe then you'll be more careful, but if you're not, you're going to pay. Okay, you've probably already seen the immediate problem with this view, which is that some harms are not compensatable, particularly death. So who are you going to compensate if you cause someone else's death? So that's an obvious problem. But there's a less obvious problem that Robert Nozick pointed out discussing this theory, which is that if you knew other people who'd go around imposing harms on you as long as they compensate afterwards, it's quite likely that you will be rather fearful. So if you go around your day thinking any moment someone could come and attack me, but they'll pay compensation afterwards, well, the fact they're going to pay compensation won't take the fear away. In some cases it might. So Nozick contrasts the harm of having your car stolen with the harm of having your arm broken. So if you know that your car is going to be stolen at some point in the next year, okay, you could get used to that. But if you knew your arm was going to be broken at some point in the next year, that would ruin the whole year. You'd go around quite fearful. And so the bad thing might never happen. So who's going to compensate that fear for you? So this is a problem with the allow every risk, but compensate the harms. One of the harms, fear, it's not a particular agent that is causing you fear. It's the atmosphere that's causing you fear. You're causing other people fear. It would be extremely unpleasant atmosphere to go around thinking that anyone can impose risks on others as long as they compensate after. So those don't work. The two theories I've looked at, the right not to have a risk imposed, second theory we can call post facto compensation, risk first, compensate later. Neither of those work. Well, what other approach is there? Let's go back to the railway safety case. So the railway safety case was really eye-opening for me when I did this work, because I'd been a philosopher quite a long time, spent a lot of time thinking about moral and political problems. It had never occurred to me to think about transport safety as a moral or political problem. In fact, I don't think it ever occurred to me to think of it as a theoretical question. But as soon as you start looking into this literature, you see there are ethical decisions being made all the time. So I told you I used to work, I was in Holborn, central London, in a law office. When I was 18, when I left school, for a few years, I was a daily commuter from Bromley South to Holborn Viaduct, which no longer exists. And in those days, some of you will remember the slam door train. So this is a train carriage where the door just opens like the door to your house. It's on a hinge, and a lock on a hinge. And at the time I was a commuter, these were not locked in the middle of the journey. So the train could be going 120 miles an hour and you could open the door, as some people did. There was a safety device. You couldn't open it from the inside. You could only open it from the outside. You might remember that. No handle on the inside. So when the train came to a halt, you had to stick your arm out of a filthy door and window and try to open it from the other side without getting your suit jacket too dirty. But anyway, as a commuter, this is what we used to do. This is what the men used to do on the train anyway. As it was coming in to the station, before it stopped, we would put our hand through the window, open the door from the outside, open it slightly, not very much, open it slightly. And then when the train came to a halt, you'd push your arm out straight. So the door would fly open, and then you could get off the train when it was still moving, and then get to your desk 5 seconds before you would have done had you left it for normal procedure. Okay. So I did this when I was 18, 19, didn't think anything of it. 15, 20 years later, when I was reading this material, what I learned for the first time was that people were dying because of these slam door trains. About 10 people a year were falling out of the train before the station. So they would let the door too early. Even more horrifying, people on the platform were being hit by the door, which was very, very heavy. And some people were dying from accidents being hit by the door. And this was even before we had those yellow lines painted on the platform. So people were standing right by the platform edge, and these doors would open, and some people would be hit and hurt very badly or even killed. So there came a point where the industry had to decide whether to replace these carriages with new carriages that were safer. And the carriages that were in use had a projected life for many more years. They weren't obsolete yet. So they had to make the decision whether to scrap them early. They modified the ones they could, but for some reason, some of them couldn't be modified. So they had to make the decision, do we get rid of these trains and replace them with other carriages, or do we leave them even though people are going to die? They said, well, how do we make that decision? Well, it's a really puzzling question morally, but from the point of view of the railway industry and industry more generally, there is an answer to it. There's an answer to this. And you do a cost-benefit analysis. You say, what is the cost of saving these lives? So the industry knew they would save maybe 20 lives a year, and they knew how it would cost, how much it would cost. That was easy to do because they had all the information. So they knew how much it would cost to save a life. And in this case, I think it was going to cost around about £5 million to save a life. So then they had to ask, is it worth it or not? Is it worth £5 million to save a life? You say, well, how do you answer that question? Well, there is an answer. And at the time I was doing this work, I was absolutely astonished to see that in the UK, the answer is that if it costs you more than £1 million to save a life, you don't have to do it. The figure now is 1.8 million. So if you can save a statistical life for 1.8 million, you have a statutory obligation to do it. Roughly, there are some caveats to this as always, but roughly, if it's going to cost less than 1.8 million to save a life, you should do it. And if it's going to cost more than that, you don't have to do it. So in this case, the railway industry didn't have to do it, but they decided to do it anyway. And we as taxpayers didn't seem to mind, but that may be because we didn't know what was going on. And had we known, it would have been quite an interesting public debate. So you think, well, where do these figures come from? Why 1 million? Why not 10 million? And the answer is that we use, or economists use, a couple of different experimental techniques to get to these figures. So in the United States, they use revealed preference measures. So what does this mean? Well, every one of us takes risks in our lives, of course, as I said before. And every now and again, we buy safety devices. So you might have bought smoke alarms for your house. If you ride a cycle, you probably bought a helmet, and you probably decided not to buy a particularly the most expensive helmet. You're going to save a little bit of money. So you in your own life have made a trade-off between safety and money. And in the old days, if you're old enough, you may remember cars used to have radial tires and cross-ply tires. One was safer than the other, but the dangerous one was cheaper. People were making their own decisions about life safety trade-offs. So revealed preference measures go around collecting information like this. How much more do you have to pay people to take a dangerous job? How much do people pay for safety devices? And you can use that through the standard methodology to come to a figure for how much we value a statistical life. In the UK, we don't tend to use that method. We ask people questions. So we ask people questions about their attitude to risk. How much would you pay for this? How much would you pay to avoid that? And again, we build up to a figure. So we do it. There's a methodology. So the methodology is a cost-benefit analysis. And roughly speaking, we say if the benefit from the risk is greater than the cost, both put in financial terms, then you can go ahead and impose that risk. Because society is better off if we allow that risk. There are greater benefits than costs if we allow that risk to go ahead. Now, there are lots of things you might wonder about this, and perhaps I'll get some questions about it in the chat, or rather the Q&A. I believe you should be putting your questions in. So if you have any questions in, you can put them now into the Q&A, and I'll answer them, or try to answer them. I will discuss them with you later on after the talk. But this view that we should use a cost-benefit analysis has lots of things in its favor. It gives us an answer. It uses a certain amount of scientific research to get to that answer. But it has a standard problem with all forms of simple consequentialism. And I'm looking at Brad when I say simple consequentialism. It has the standard problem with all forms of simple consequentialism, which is that it doesn't really pay any attention to who gets the costs and who gets the benefits. So there's a distributional problem here, that if rich people are getting all the benefits from risk taking and other people are suffering all the costs, then that hardly seems fair, even if there's a total benefit to society. So the cost benefit analysis on its own has a problem about distribution. So you might say, well, there's a simple alternative. The fourth theory, so let me just remind you what the other theories were. The first theory was we have a right not to have a risk imposed upon us. The second theory was let everyone do what they want, but compensate for harm after. The third one is this type of cost-benefit analysis. If the benefits outweigh the costs, you should go ahead. The fourth one says, well, let's think about it a different way. Think about something like driving. It is true that by driving your car, you impose risks on others, and that is a problem. But other people driving their cars impose risks on you. And perhaps you think it's the better world in which people can impose these risks as long as we control them. No one drives crazy, no one drives drunk, no one drives under the influence of too many drugs, and no one drives a car they haven't maintained properly. As long as people minimize the risk in sensible ways, it's better for all of us if we allow this risky practice. So you can say there's a sense in which we consent to the practice, even if we don't consent to individual occasions, individual instances. So I don't consent to this person driving behind me, but I do consent to a system in which someone can drive behind me, perhaps. What sense do I do that? Obviously, no one ever asked me that, but you could say, well, it's a hypothetical consent. And so this is the theory, I think, that is most prominent now among people who think about risk, which is to say, imagine yourself behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing whether you're going to be imposing risks, whether you're going to be receiving risks. But you know it's possible that you might be imposing, it's possible you might be receiving. What level of risk would you accept? And what fair distribution, or what would count as a fair distribution? And to try this, to bring this alive at the moment, if you think about how we were under lockdown, so people like me who could do their work from home, if I wanted to, I could order all my food from an online source. I didn't have to leave home. I could do everything by Zoom. People were bringing me parcels of things. All I had to do was go onto the internet and order something. People would bring it to me. I was getting my normal salary. Like many of you probably realize, your expenses were going down because you weren't getting trains, weren't going to the theatre. And there's only a limit to how much you can spend on food, however hard you try. So for a lot of us, we were limited in our activity, but we were insulated from risk. But other people were far from insulated. People doing essential work, delivery drivers, health workers, they were experiencing a heightened level of risk. How would we think about that from behind the veil of ignorance? Now, what is interesting, I think, is we might say, well, it just has to be done. There has to be some people in society who have to bear a higher level of risk. But it's very unlikely we'll say, so that's that then. We just see who suffers from this higher level of risk and just get on with it. If we knew that we could be those people, what would we do? Well, first of all, we would insist on risk mitigation measures. We'd insist on ways of keeping that risk to the absolute minimum. Secondly, we would want to compensate them for being subject to risk. And what we would also want to do is to give them a really good compensation if the bad thing happens. So the idea would be that, from this hypothetical contract position, we would take much more care of people who are taking risks for us than we have done under sort of the standard economy. So I think one thing we can say is that probably the way the government is carrying on is mostly using a type of cost-benefit analysis, thinking things have to go on, there are going to be costs and there are going to be benefits. As long as the benefits outweigh the costs, that's fine. But many of us would be thinking more in this hypothetical consent sense, which says, well, unless things are shared out relatively equally or as equally as we can do, there's something going wrong. If one group is benefiting and the other is getting all the costs, something's going wrong. But also we could go back to the post facto compensation theory, It says if the bad thing happens, there should be compensation. So what I would suggest is that the answer to the question of the ethics of risk, maybe this is a boring answer that you knew this before I even started, but maybe it's good to see it against other theories, is that we should think about what risks we would tolerate if we were behind the veil of ignorance and had to come up with a system not knowing whether we were going to be subject to the risk or not. And then we would think about lots of ways of mitigating and compensating for the risks for people who are taking exceptional risks. And I think one of the scandals of COVID is that we haven't done that, and that we have allowed risks to fall on low-paid workers with less voice, less power, less privilege than others. And I guess my conclusion is we should be ashamed of ourselves for that. And maybe I should just finish at that point. I think this is just about my time is up. So thank you for listening. And I see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, so let me see. Okay. With the 1.8 requirements, is this affected by whether the lives saved are those of children or the elderly? From Kitty Bright. So this is a really good question. How much time have I got here? If you're aware of how decision-making is done in the health, we talk about quality-adjusted life years. And so if you've got longer to live, there's a sense in which it's worth spending more on you than if you don't have much time. And there are definitely people who have said that we ought to do the same thing for risk analysis, so that if someone has less time to live, their life should be worth less, right? If they've got more time to live, they should be worth more. Okay, so what are the implications of that? The implications are that if you're elderly, we shouldn't pay much for your safety. So, for example, in old people's homes, we shouldn't bother about fire alarms because they don't have many. Right, okay, so I can't see your faces, but I'm hoping you're looking horrified at that. The other end of it is we should pay more for children, and that might be right, but that might not just be because they've got more years to live, but because they're less capable of taking care of their own safety. So there's a bit of a paternalistic argument. So the 1.8 million, no, we don't make a distinction, but there are people in government who wished we did, because then we could spend a lot less, particularly on the elderly. But at the moment, we don't make that distinction. Okay, Charlotte's question. When the cause-effect relations are opaque, it seems to me simple consequentialism fails at least on the level of individual human reasoning. Situation now, mask wearing, safe so clear. Why do people still fail at being ethical? So I think there's about 4 questions wrapped up into 25 words there. So one thing to bear in mind is, so the first half of this, cost-benefit analysis only works if you've got good numbers, if you've got good probabilities. So when I was working in the railway industry, this was fine because, I was working with the railway industry rather than in. I didn't go quite that native, but I was working with the railway industry. They have these long-standing databases of how many injuries there were and how many deaths on the railways. So they know pretty much if they change one thing, what the consequence is going to be. But that's very unusual. So speaking to people who worked in the oil and gas industry, they don't have a long database for oil rigs blowing up. There's only been a small number. So you never really know what the consequences are of the decision. So cost-benefit analysis doesn't really, this type of risk analysis, economists make a distinction between risk and uncertainty. Cost-benefit analysis works well for situations of risk. It's terrible for situations of uncertainty because we can't do the sums. We just don't know what the probabilities are. And here's the clincher. Life is almost always a situation of uncertainty rather than risk. So that's because we just don't know the probabilities of our actions. So cost-benefit analysis is not suitable. I have written about this because economists have got a great theory that doesn't apply to the real world. And so what they try to do is adjust it to try to adapt it to the real world, and it doesn't work. So they just need to use that theory for a very small number of situations. We need a different approach, which we don't really have for situations of uncertainty. Now, the other half of that question is about mask wearing. It says the benefits are very clear. Why do people still fail at being ethical? It's amazing, isn't it, that this has become politicized. and a mask has become a symbol of something. And it's not just, it's not like putting a plaster on or a cut finger. By wearing a mask, I mean, when I wear a mask, I feel sort of smug, and I feel like I'm telling everyone else a lesson if they're not wearing something. So there's become some symbolic meaning to the mask, but it's a really good question. And one thing that struck me is that wearing a mask is very similar to banning smoking indoors, because the reason why we're doing this is to stop you harming other people. And we had very little trouble, to my surprise, we had very little trouble stopping people smoking indoors. But we have some trouble getting people wearing a mask indoors. So this is a topic for a sociology PhD thesis in the future. I think, why is there that difference? Okay, Matt, is it ethical to buy insurance to pay for the potential harm you might cause to others? All right, so why might it not be ethical? Well, because of, I don't know why you thought that, but here's one possible answer. There's something called moral hazard in insurance. So once you've bought insurance, insurance companies think that you might stop taking care. So if I have very good house insurance, why bother locking the door when I go out? Because if anything gets stolen, then I'll get it covered. And so insurance companies do a lot to try to prevent this. So one thing you probably have on your car insurance is excess. You have to pay the first few £100. And that's meant to encourage you to take care. Or on your home insurance, if you don't lock the door, it invalidates the policy. Because they know that the natural thing is that if you can buy insurance, then you'll take less care. So that would be one reason for saying it's not ethical to buy or even sell insurance to pay for potential harm, because you're more likely to cause harm to other people if you're insured. And therefore, the other way around, you're less likely to cause harm if you're not insured. So I don't know, Matt, if you're there, if that answers your question. If not, do follow up. Actually, I haven't answered your question. Is it ethical to buy insurance? Well, I think it would be ethical as long as it didn't change your behavior. But as soon as it changes your behavior, maybe it's not ethical. Okay, Critica, on your account, standing behind the veil of ignorance, how should we think about prioritizing mitigating risks in the long term versus short term? Example, should we prioritize spending money to mitigate those risks that may occur harms in 50 years from now rather than the next 5 years? Okay, long-term harms and discount rates. There's also the point, this is right, if we have a thin veil of ignorance, I know for certain I'm not going to be around in 50 years' time. So from the point of view of veil of ignorance, if I am thinking just for myself, then I wouldn't pay any attention to what happens in 50 years' time. What we would have to do would be to have a atemporal veil of ignorance that you don't know where you are. But this is a really deep question. In fact, Reading, you do a lot of work on climate change in Reading. And this is, I think, the moral question of our time, actually, which is about discount rates for future harms. Because if you cast your mind back to the Stern report, when the Stern report came out, for the first time, business leaders started taking, in this country anyway, started taking climate change seriously. And the reason for that is that Stern used a very low discount rate for the future. And so future harms suddenly started to figure into the calculations. But before Stern, people used a much higher discount rate, so that anything that happened in about 50 years' time counts for nothing. Because if you've got a discount rate, a compound discount rate of 6%, as the Treasury recommends, anything in 50 years' time is more or less nothing. Stern reduced the discount rate to 1%, and then, okay, there's still a significant discount in 50 years, but only, about 35%, 40% discount, rather than maybe 80, 90% there would have been, or more, with a 6% discount rate, probably more. So it's amazing to think that the great ethical dilemma of our time, or problem of our time, about climate change turns on what looks like a technical question on economics, which is how much should we discount the future in financial terms. And yeah, I was thinking about this only the other day. There are two general reasons why we discount the future. One is because we think future lives are not worth as much as now. And that is a terrible reason. I mean, there's no reason for thinking that future lives are not as valuable as lives now. The other reason is that we know much less about the future than we do about now. So we have to put a sort of ignorance discount in. Stern put in a discount for the fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, that we might not even exist in 100 years' time. You know, if a meteorite hits the Earth and we go extinct, and there's some chance of that, so maybe we shouldn't spend so much on the future because maybe there's no one here. Well, I was thinking, and maybe one day I'll write about this, but I don't quite have the courage now, is to think about 50 years, 100 years' time. Well, what was 100 years ago or 150 years ago? 150 years ago, we were in the Victorian era in the UK, in Western Europe. And Victorians had quite different priorities than us, quite different interests. How would we feel about knowing that, you know, the Victorians had made some special provision for us to make sure we all had prayer books or something, or whatever it was that was most important to them? They made provision so we would all have them now. We'd think, how quaint, how ahistoric, how sweet, how foolish, how misguided. Right? So I think that although interests of future generations are important, obviously people don't want to die, they don't want to be harmed. There's a limit to how much we can say, I think, about what we should be doing for future generations. Okay, but anyway, the short answer is yes, we ought to prioritize spending money now to mitigate risks that occur now, but only because we have a much better sense of what they are. And in 50 years' time, we might have got completely the wrong end of the stick. So why waste money doing something that won't work in the future rather than doing something we know could be good now? All right. So I think we're getting to the end of the allocated time. I'm just looking in the chat to see if there's anything there, which I can't see. For some reason, I don't seem to have access to the chat.
I think the questions are all in the Q&A.
Okay.
In the chat. But let me take this opportunity, Joe. I know you have to run off for another meeting, but let me take this opportunity to thank you. We're extremely grateful to you for sharing your ideas about this with us, and we've had a terrific turnout today, and we just can't thank you enough. So with that, I'll let you go.
It's a real pleasure for me, and it's wonderful to be able to talk for so long uninterrupted. So I always like these occasions. So thank you so much for listening, to the participants who stayed with us and for the people in the Q&A. And yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll maybe look at the next ethical reading.
Thank you to everyone. I'm just going to close by giving you our call to action. Please think about joining Ethical Reading if you haven't already. And you can see that we're on every bit of social media that we can think of: Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. We also have a meetup sign up site. And if you look at ethicalreading.org.uk, you'll get a feeling for the whole slew of things we're doing. I think that as a consequence of your attending this meeting today, you will get a questionnaire to fill out, an evaluation form to fill out. We'd be grateful if you'd fill that out and help us refine how we do things in the future. But at the moment, I just want to say thank you very much for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Goodbye.